A few have asked, now that I have this metal Pantorouter built by Coldeep, do I still need my wooden one? Well, I'm keeping it because I like having more machines and I built this one. But I thought I'd do a quick comparison just to show you the differences between the two machines. What struck me when I put the machines side by side is how similar these two machines are, even though they're built actually completely differently. The table on the homemade one is 46 centimeters wide, and on the aluminum one it's 45.5. Depth-wise, this one is at 34 centimeters, and the aluminum one is at 30. The pantograph on the aluminum one has the main link at 24 centimeters long, and on the homemade one it's exactly 24 centimeters long as well. So the pantograph essentially is about the same size, which means it has the same reach, and it's primarily limited by bumping into the template frame. So the size of the template frame on the homemade machine is 33 centimeters, and on the metal one it is also 33 centimeters. In terms of height for the template frame, on this one it is about 6 inches. Unfortunately I don't have a metric square. And on the aluminum one it is also about 6 inches. So there's about the same range of motion for the router on both of these, which means they can both cut the same size stock. The clamp on my homemade Pantorouter is this clamp, which I can adjust in many ways and add more blocks to change the height, and it works fairly conveniently together with the stop. On the aluminum Pantorouter there is a rail here and two Bessie toggle clamps, and these toggle clamps are really nice because they're self-adjusting. But I do need to tell you, these clamps are not included by default. You have to pay extra for those for the metal Pantorouter. For clamping really tall stock, I added this riser block to bring this clamp way up so I can even clamp a 2x4 on its side. But on this Pantorouter, the toggle clamps just don't have the right kind of reach. So for the large stock, I don't use the toggle clamps, and I just use the stock right there, and I clamp it to the edge of the table just with a bar clamp. And that works fairly well. I was afraid that I might actually route into one of my clamps with a router, but if I'm mortising into one of these things, I've always got the follower inside the mortising template, so I actually am very restricted with how far the router can move, so there's no risk of accidentally routing into one of the clamps. I thought clamping over the edge actually was a really cool idea, given that you're not likely to route into the clamp, so I just cut a slot into the part of the table here on mine, so I can now use clamps on here as well. I really like the way the follower bearings are mounted on a shaft here, where if I'm cutting a tenon I just follow around the template, and then to cut the mortise I pull this out and put it in the other way around and put that inside the template to follow it for the mortise. And if I want to cut different size tenons, I can change the router bit, or I can swap out my follower for one that has a much smaller thing on the end, and that will cause the router to follow the template closer, which will cut a smaller tenon. On my homemade machine I have several of these blocks with different size bearings mounted on them, and I have to swap these out when I want to cut different size tenons. And I don't have a slot inside the tenon template because I don't actually have anything that goes in here. It's been suggested to make something like this for the homemade one, and I could conceivably drill a hole through here to put one of these in, but without having metalworking ability, I wouldn't know how to mount a bearing on a shaft like this, so I decided to stick with these ones here because they're just much easier to make. Some more differences. The metal Pantorouter actually has a considerably greater depth of plunge, especially after I tweaked the design a little bit. And that's really useful if you're cutting a long tenon, because you want to be able to cut that off the end of the table, and you want to be able to back the router away from it. On the homemade machine, I can only get this far away from it, so I really should have used longer drawer slides for the plunge mechanism. I like how the plunge stop on the metal Pantorouter is a little bit easier to reach, because with the stops right here, I can just put the calipers in here and measure what my actual plunge depth is, and that is useful for tenons, because when I'm cutting tenons I'll typically use the front of the router bit as my depth stop with the router all the way back, and then that tells me exactly how far forward I can go. because otherwise it's very hard to have a front side depth stop on this machine. On my homemade Pantorouter machine, the depth stops are underneath the table, which unfortunately makes them a little bit harder to see, and that means I can't really get in there with a caliper as well and read off what the number is, at least not while I'm actually holding it on there. The template holder on the metal Pantorouter has got the scale on both sides, which is very useful for making sure this template is on there vertically when you slide it up and down, because it's easy to get it just a tiny bit crooked. And if this scale is set to 0, then that slot will correspond to the level of the table. So if you want to put the tenon in the middle of something, you just set this to the thickness of your stock right here. And because the pantograph scales it by a factor of 2, that means the router will cut in the middle of the stock on the table. On the homemade machine, I don't have any convenient scale like that. So I added these two blocks here, and on these I can clamp a setup bar, and when that setup bar is properly set up, that represents the level of the table. So if I want to be, say, 10 millimeters above the level of the table, I know I need to go twice as far above the setup bar, because the pantograph, of course, will scale it down by a factor of 2. But the biggest difference between the two machines is one of time and money. I probably spent about $60 in material on this one, using a lot of used materials as well. Whereas if you buy one of these, it'll cost you over 10 times as much, but then again, it will take you less than a tenth of the time to assemble this one than it will this one. And this one, especially with the pantograph already assembled, you can be sure the machine will be accurate, whereas on this one, you have to be on the ball and make sure you work precisely when you build it. I have two Pantorouter machines.